Why did Winston Churchill erupt in a cold, calculated fury as he stood over a map of Western Europe in late 1944, while Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery demanded every gallon of fuel for a disastrous gamble at Arnhem? General George S. Patton was liberating 12 cities on half rations, proving that leadership, not just logistics, wins wars. This is the untold story of a leadership crisis that nearly fractured the Allied command during World War II. London sat shrouded in a damp, oppressive fog on the morning of September 25, 1944, as the hollow silence of the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall mirrored the growing dread within the heart of Winston Churchill. For months, the Prime Minister had watched the Allies surge across France with a mixture of predatory excitement and mounting anxiety, knowing that the window to end the war by Christmas was slamming shut against the stubborn resilience of a retreating but far from defeated Wehrmacht. Churchill paced the cramped confines of his map room, his fingers tracing the thin, precarious line of Operation Market Garden, a bold but increasingly desperate airborne thrust designed by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery to leapfrog the Rhine and strike the industrial heart of Germany. The reports filtering back from the Dutch border were no longer optimistic, replaced instead by frantic radio bursts and the chilling realization that the British 1st Airborne Division was being systematically annihilated at Arnhem. Churchill, a man who lived for the grand strategic stroke, felt the bitter sting of a gamble gone wrong. But his frustration was not merely born of tactical failure. It was fueled by a glaring, undeniable contrast occurring 200 miles to the south. While Montgomery's massive operation consumed the lion's share of Allied resources, including 1,400 tons of fuel per day, General George S. Patton and his Third Army were conducting a masterclass in aggressive, mobile warfare on a shoestring budget. Churchill grabbed a folder marked Urgent Eye Only and slammed it onto the table, his eyes fixed on the staggering disparity in the casualty lists and territorial gains that mocked the current British strategy. The Prime Minister knew that he was presiding over a coalition held together by the diplomatic tact of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Yet the statesman in him could no longer ignore the military reality that George Patton was delivering miracles, while Montgomery was delivering excuses. This was the moment the British line began to roar not at his enemies, but at his own commanders, questioning the very foundations of a logistics-first strategy that seemed to reward caution over results. The psychological landscape of the Allied High Command was a minefield of ego, national pride, and conflicting philosophies that threatened to derail the momentum gained since D-Day. Bernard Montgomery, the hero of El Alamein, believed in the single thrust theory, a concentrated, overwhelming hammer blow that required every drop of fuel, every truck, and every airframe the Allies possessed. He viewed the war as a mathematical equation to be solved through meticulous preparation and the total suppression of enemy resistance before a single soldier moved forward. In stark contrast, George S. Patton viewed war as a fluid, violent art form governed by speed, violence of action, and the relentless exploitation of enemy confusion. Patton's mindset was one of perpetual motion, believing that as long as his tanks were moving, the enemy could never find the breath to counterattack, even if it meant his men went into battle with empty stomachs and half-full fuel tanks. Churchill recognized these two archetypes as the competing souls of the Allied war effort. But as the failure at Arnhem became a certainty, his admiration for Montgomery's caution evaporated into a cloud of cigar smoke. The Prime Minister summoned General Hastings Ismay, demanding a side-by-side comparison of the fuel allocations and the captured prisoners, his voice low and vibrating with a dangerous energy. He saw that Patton's Third Army, operating on a mere 700 tons of fuel a day, had successfully breached the Moselle River, captured Nancy, and was currently hammering at the gates of Metz. Patton's casualties were a fraction of what Montgomery had lost in 9 days of botched airborne drops. Yet Eisenhower continued to funnel the lifeblood of the army toward the north. Churchill's despair was not born of a lack of courage, but from the fear that the war would extend into 1945 simply because they were backing the wrong general. He understood that the British public, weary from 5 years of bombardment and rationing, would not forgive a disaster that could have been avoided by empowering the American old blood and guts. The tension in the war rooms reached a breaking point when Churchill realized that Montgomery had ignored warnings from the Dutch resistance about 2 SS Panzer divisions refitting in the very drop zones assigned to the British paratroopers. This negligence was not just a mistake. In Churchill's eyes, it was a betrayal of the elite troops who were currently fighting and dying for a bridge that was, in the now famous words of his commanders, a bridge too far. The tactical execution of Patton's drive through the Lorraine region stood as a visceral rebuke to the stagnation in the north, as the Third Army engaged in a relentless pursuit of the retreating German First Army. Patton's tankers, often forced to scavenge fuel from captured enemy depots or abandoned vehicles, executed a series of brilliant flanking maneuvers that bypassed heavy fortifications and struck at the enemy's rear. While Montgomery's forces were bogged down in the narrow flooded corridors of the Dutch polders, Patton was utilizing the rolling terrain of eastern France to unleash the full fury of armored warfare. He pushed his commanders to the brink of exhaustion, famously stating that he didn't want his men to hold their positions, but to hold the enemy by the nose and kick them in the rear. This aggressive posture allowed the Third Army to cross 3 major rivers in less than a week, capturing 45,000 German prisoners, while the world's attention was fixed on the tragedy unfolding at Arnhem. The sheer velocity of Patton's advance created a psychological collapse among the German defenders, who found themselves constantly outmaneuvered by an army they believed was immobilized by supply shortages. Churchill devoured these reports with a hunger that bordered on obsession, seeing in Patton the embodiment of the British naval tradition of engage the enemy more closely. He saw a commander who understood that in the chaos of 1944, the most precious resource wasn't fuel or ammunition, but time. The Prime Minister's frustration reached its zenith when he looked at the maps of the Rhineland and realized that Patton was less than 20 miles from the German border. Yet his advance was being throttled by a headquarters that prioritized a failed British operation. Churchill grabbed the secure telephone line to Versailles, his jaw set in a grim line as he prepared to confront Eisenhower with the cold, hard numbers of the fuel reports. He knew that any public criticism of Montgomery would be seen as a slap in the face to the British military establishment, but the lives of his soldiers outweighed the sensitivities of a field marshal's ego. As the phone rang, Churchill looked at the portrait of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, seeking the resolve to demand a radical shift in the Allied strategy. He was no longer just a politician. He was a war leader who saw the path to victory being choked by the red tape of his own making. The conversation that followed would be one of the most strained in the history of the Anglo-American alliance, as Churchill laid out the devastating evidence of Patton's success against Montgomery's catastrophe. He pointed out that while Montgomery had advanced 64 miles into a tactical dead end, Patton had advanced 60 miles into the heart of the enemy's defensive line. The Prime Minister's voice crackled with indignation as he asked Eisenhower how it was possible that a general with half the fuel could achieve 10 times the results. He demanded to know why they were rewarding failure with more resources while punishing success with starvation. Eisenhower, caught between the political necessity of keeping the British involved and the military reality of Patton's genius, could only offer diplomatic platitudes that did little to soothe Churchill's rising temper. The Allied command was now a house divided, with the ghost of Arnhem haunting every decision and the shadow of George Patton looming over the entire European theater. Churchill's anger was further stoked by the arrival of the casualty list from the 1st Airborne Division, where out of 10,000 men who dropped, only 2,000 had made it back across the Rhine. These were the finest men Britain had to offer, lost in a gamble that Montgomery still insisted was 90% successful. Churchill found this assessment not only delusional, but offensive, as he compared it to Patton's capture of 12 cities with minimal loss of life. He began to draft a series of scathing memos, questioning the intelligence capabilities of the 21st Army Group and demanding a complete overhaul of the supply priority system. The Prime Minister realized that the broad front strategy was becoming a broad failure, if it meant slowing down the one man who could actually win the war. He saw that the Germans were using the lull in the north to consolidate their defenses, a luxury they would never have had if Patton had been given the fuel he needed to cross the Rhine in September. The air in London seemed to grow colder as Churchill contemplated the possibility of a winter campaign, a prospect he had desperately hoped to avoid. He knew that every day they wasted on Montgomery's meticulously planned stagnations was a day the Germans used to build the Siegfried Line into an impenetrable wall of steel and concrete. The contrast between the two sectors was so stark that it began to leak into the British press, with headlines demanding to know why the Americans were taking cities while the British were taking casualties. Churchill's office was flooded with letters from grieving families, each one a needle prick to his conscience, as he realized the human cost of military vanity. He decided that he must visit the front himself, not to offer praise, but to see the disparity with his own eyes and to look Montgomery in the face. He wanted to see if the field marshal felt the same weight of the 10,000 names on the casualty list, or if he was still lost in the maps of his own making. This journey would be a turning point in Churchill's relationship with his commanders, as he prepared to descend from the clouds of high strategy into the mud and blood of the front lines. He packed his bags with a heavy heart, knowing that the confrontation he was seeking would either save the Allied effort or shatter it completely. The Prime Minister's resolve was ironclad. He would no longer allow the ghost of Arnhem to dictate the future of the war when the fire of George Patton was ready to burn the Reich to the ground. The world held its breath as the British leader crossed the English Channel, moving toward a collision of wills that would determine whether the war would end in a triumph of aggression or a tragedy of caution. Churchill's flight toward France was not just a diplomatic mission. It was a desperate attempt to inject the spirit of Patton into a command structure that had become infected with the lethargy of Montgomery's planning. As the wheels of his transport plane touched down on French soil, the Prime Minister stepped out into the crisp autumn air, ready to wage a war of words that would be just as decisive as the battles being fought in the forests of the Ardennes. The tires of Winston Churchill's staff car crunched over the gravel of the temporary Allied headquarters in Eindhoven, the sound echoing like small arms fire through the damp, morning air of October 2nd, 1944. The Prime Minister stepped out into a landscape that felt fundamentally broken, where the skeletal remains of gliders in nearby fields served as silent wooden monuments to a plan that had reached too far and grasped too little. Bernard Montgomery met him with a crisp salute and a face like granite. Yet Churchill's greeting was as cold as the North Sea, his mind already calculating the cost of the Field Marshal's stubbornness. They drove toward the Nijmegen Bridge, a structure that had been bought with the lives of American paratroopers. But as they stood on its massive girders, Churchill looked north toward the invisible, blood-soaked streets of Arnhem. He saw not a strategic victory, but a graveyard of ambition, where 10,000 of his finest soldiers had been sacrificed on the altar of a single-thrust theory that had fundamentally failed to account for the reality of German resilience. Churchill's silence was more devastating than any shouted reprimand as he stood on the riverbank, staring at the gray, churning waters of the Wall River, while Montgomery began a rehearsed defense of the operation. The Field Marshal spoke of tactical gains in the drawing of German reserves, but Churchill interrupted him with a single, brutal question regarding the fuel reports he had carried from London. He demanded to know how a man provided with 1,400 tons of fuel every single day could stand before a bridge he did not hold, while an American general to the south was taking cities with half that amount. Montgomery's jaw tightened as he dismissed Patton's sector as a secondary theater of no strategic importance, a claim that Churchill found increasingly absurd given the 45,000 German prisoners currently being processed by the Third Army. The Prime Minister realized that the disparity was not just a matter of geography or enemy strength, but a fundamental difference in the soul of command, where one man planned like a lawyer while the other executed like a warrior. The journey south to General George Patton's sector in Nancy was like traveling to a different war entirely, where the atmosphere of stagnant dread was replaced by the electric hum of an army in constant violent motion. Churchill arrived to find Patton not in a secluded chateau, but standing amidst a sea of mud and steel, barking orders to a staff that moved with a frantic, purposeful energy that the Prime Minister had not seen since the early days of the Blitz. Patton greeted Churchill with a grin and a map that was covered in blue arrows, each one representing a liberated town or a shattered German division that had been bypassed and destroyed. There were no excuses here about fuel shortages or inconclusive intelligence, only a relentless focus on the next river crossing and the next objective, pointing to 12 fortified cities that had fallen in the same 9 days that Montgomery had spent bogged down in the Dutch polders. Churchill felt a surge of vitality as he listened to Patton describe the capture of Nancy, where the Third Army had ignored the traditional rules of siege warfare to strike at the enemy's heart before they could even organize a defense. Patton explained that he treated fuel not as a commodity to be hoarded, but as a weapon to be spent as rapidly as possible, to buy the only thing that mattered in war, which was the enemy's confusion and ultimate collapse. The Prime Minister watched as Patton's tankers refueled their Shermans with a speed that bordered on the miraculous. utilizing a logistical chain that was being held together by nothing more than sheer willpower in the Red Ball Express. Churchill realized that while Montgomery was waiting for the perfect moment to move, Patton was creating perfection through the very act of moving. A realization that made the 1,400 tons of fuel wasted in the North feel like a criminal act of negligence. The confrontation that followed at the Supreme Allied Headquarters in Versailles was the climax of a brewing storm that threatened to tear the coalition apart at its very seams. Churchill sat across from Dwight D. Eisenhower, the weight of the Arnhem casualty list pressing down on him like a physical burden, while the ghost of the 1st Airborne Division seemed to fill the room. He slammed his hand on the table, demanding a total reversal of the supply priorities, arguing that the Allies could no longer afford to subsidize Montgomery's failures at the expense of Patton's successes. Eisenhower looked exhausted, caught between the political necessity of keeping the British involved and the military logic that Patton was his most effective weapon. Churchill's voice rose as he pointed out that the German border was being reached not by the army with the most resources, but by the army with the most audacity. General Omar Bradley, Patton's immediate superior, sat in the corner and provided the technical data that supported Churchill's fury, showing that the Third Army's cost per mile was a fraction of any other Allied force. Bradley's quiet, professional assessment was the final nail in the coffin of Montgomery's single-thrust dominance, as he revealed that Patton had breached the Siegfried Line defenses, while the Northern Front was still repairing bridges. Churchill seized on this, telling Eisenhower that he would rather have a general who won battles with nothing than a field marshal who lost them with everything. The room was thick with a tension that transcended national borders, as the British Prime Minister effectively campaigned for an American general to lead the charge into Germany. He knew that the only way to shorten the war was to empower the man who didn't know how to stop, even if it meant bruising the ego of every British officer in the 21st Army Group. The result of this explosive meeting was a permanent shift in the Allied broad front policy, as Eisenhower finally authorized an increase in Patton's fuel allocation at the direct request of the British Prime Minister. This decision was not merely a logistical adjustment, but a strategic pivot that recognized the changing nature of the war as it moved toward the German heartland. Patton reacted to the news with a characteristic burst of aggression, immediately launching an assault on the fortress city of Metz that the Germans believed was impregnable. He used his new resources to unleash a hurricane of artillery and armored thrusts that pulverized the German defenders before they could even realize their supply lines had been cut. Churchill watched from London as the blue arrows on his map began to race toward the Rhine, a sight that provided the only comfort he could find after the tragedy of the Dutch campaign. As the winter of 1944 descended with a brutal, unforgiving cold, the ultimate test of leadership arrived in the form of Hitler's final gamble in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge caught the Allied command by surprise, creating a massive vacuum in the lines and surrounding the American forces at Bastogne in a pocket of ice fire. While Montgomery reacted with his usual caution, requesting weeks to organize a proper counteroffensive, Patton stood up in a meeting and promised to turn his entire army 90 degrees in 48 hours. This claim was met with derision by many in the room, yet Patton had already issued the orders before the meeting had even concluded. He understood that this was the moment that would define the war, where the speed he had practiced in France would save the lives of thousands of men trapped in the snow. The Third Army's march to Bastogne remains one of the greatest feats of military logistics and leadership in human history, as 3 full divisions pivoted through snow and ice to strike the German flank. Patton personally stood at crossroads to direct traffic, his presence an iron guarantee that the momentum would not falter even as the temperatures plummeted below zero. They reached the beleaguered paratroopers in 72 hours, breaking the siege and effectively ending the German offensive's hope of reaching the sea. Churchill, hearing the news in London, turned to his wife and remarked that while Montgomery was still planning his positions, Patton had already won the battle. The Prime Minister felt a sense of vindication that was bittersweet, knowing that if Patton had been given this level of support in September, the Ardennes offensive might never have happened at all. The final months of the war saw Patton's Third Army racing across southern Germany with a velocity that terrified both the German High Command and the Allied logisticians who struggled to keep up. They crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim in a surprise night assault that Patton famously celebrated by personally relieving himself in the river to mock the German defenses. He was no longer just a general. He was a force of nature that was tearing the Reich apart from the inside, liberating concentration camps and capturing entire German armies in a series of brilliant pincer movements. Montgomery, meanwhile, conducted a massive over-engineered crossing of the Rhine in the north that involved thousands of aircraft and weeks of preparation, only to find that the Germans had already been hollowed out by Patton's advances. Churchill's historical verdict was becoming clear in real time, as the lawyer and the clerk were overshadowed by the warrior who had mastered the art of the impossible. When the war finally ended in May 1945, Patton's troops were deep in Czechoslovakia, having advanced further and faster than any or other Allied force in history. The statistical comparison that Churchill had demanded in September 1944 remained the definitive proof of Patton's superiority, with the Third Army having captured over 300,000 prisoners and liberated 80,000 square miles of territory. Montgomery had secured the northern ports and played a vital role in the war's conclusion, but he never regained the strategic initiative or the absolute trust of the British Prime Minister. Churchill's memoirs would later reflect this disparity with a subtle, cutting grace, noting that while many men can follow a plan, only a few can master the chaos of the battlefield. The legacy of the leadership crisis in 1944 was a lesson in the dangers of rewarding caution and the transformative power of a commander who views every obstacle as an opportunity for aggression. The human cost of the delay caused by the focus on the north was something Churchill carried to his grave, particularly the memory of the men lost at Arnhem who died for a bridge that was never captured. He realized that in the high-stakes game of global war, the most dangerous thing a leader can do is play it safe when the enemy is on the ropes. Patton's death in a car accident shortly after the war's end served as a tragic postscript to a career defined by movement, but his influence on military doctrine was already permanent. He had proven that an army's strength is not measured in tons of fuel or numbers of tanks, but in the speed of its decisions and the resolve of its commander. Churchill's admiration for Patton was the admiration of one great disruptor for another, two men who understood that history is not made by those who wait, but by those who strike. Looking back at the documents and the heated exchanges in the cabinet war rooms, we see a Winston Churchill who was more than just a politician. He was a man struggling to ensure that the sacrifices of his people were not wasted on the vanities of his generals. The rage of Churchill was not a sign of instability, but a manifestation of his deep commitment to a victory that was both swift and decisive. He saw in George Patton the mirror of his own restless energy, a man who would rather break the rules and win than follow them and lose. This clash of titans between Churchill, Montgomery, and Patton remains a central pillar of World War II history, a reminder that even in the most organized of wars, the individual spirit of a leader remains the ultimate deciding factor. The final victory in Europe was a triumph of the Allied coalition, but it was also a personal victory for the strategy of aggression that Churchill had championed during the darkest days of 1944. The fields of France and the forests of Germany are still marked by the path of Patton's tanks, a trail of liberation that was fueled by half the resources but twice the courage. As we analyze the maps and the casualty list today, the lesson remains as clear as it was to Churchill over 80 years ago. Resources are finite, but leadership is the force multiplier that turns a stalemate into a surge. The story of the general who took 12 cities while the other lost 10,000 men is not just a military anecdote. It is the definitive case study in the weight of command. The legacy of this leadership struggle continues to be studied in military academies across the globe, serving as a warning against the paralysis of overanalysis and the vital necessity of backing the right horse in the race for survival. Churchill's willingness to challenge his own nation's military icons in favor of a foreign general's results remains a testament to his singular focus on the ultimate goal of defeating tyranny. In the end, the war was won not by the commanders who demanded the most, but by those who did the most with what they were given, a truth that George Patton lived and Winston Churchill recognized. Their combined legacy is the world we live in today, a world bought with the speed of the Third Army and the iron will of a prime minister who refused to accept anything less than excellence. Do you think the war would have ended in 1944 if Eisenhower had given Patton the fuel priority instead of Montgomery's Market Garden? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.